Alright, so I decided to break up the slides here so that you would have that first video that walked you through the context, and then this video, I want to walk you through the novel itself. And I know that you just read a small excerpt, but I want to walk you through some kind of key scenes and elements from the book, because you don't have a chance to read it, but it really is a masterpiece in terms of engaging with this idea of the streets as, a geographic space of kind of, on one hand, that is the product of anti-Black racism and segregationist policy, but on the other hand, it's a space that fosters kind of uprising and the art that we see from Petry herself as the writer. So this is part of what I want to walk you through. So bear with me. I'm going to walk you and read a few passages and explain, but it's a chance for you to maybe get a sense of the book without having read it yet. And then I'd encourage you, again, if you enjoy reading and are looking for your next book, this is a good book to pick up. And I'm very biased because it's one of my favorite books, but I do think it really is an interesting book. Spoilers, though, I am going to talk about the ending. So if you do plan on reading it, maybe skip part of this video. I don't know. Not really a way to solve that. But let's talk about the street. And I like to put the different covers, by the way, because it's always fascinating to me how artists and publishers kind of envision the characters of the novel itself. So, all right, so The Street, as we talked about, was published in 1946, but it's worth kind of putting it in context, right? So this is just 12 years after the kind of federal housing policies went into effect that subsidized kind of white middle-class home ownership and created, white suburban spaces. This is also, 12 years into the policies that are fostering or ushering Black people further into the cities, into kind of housing projects, into spaces where there, especially we talked about Harlem in the last video, less public, workspaces, so less parks, less public services and things like that, high density, poor quality housing. These are some of the conditions, right, that the book was published in, that Petry herself was living, witnessing, and writing about, right? This is after she moved there, and she is, involved in the community and participating after school programs, studying writing at Columbia. So all this comes together to produce this work. So the book itself is set in Harlem in 1944. And it follows the protagonist, Ludi Johnson, who, we talked about this a little bit before. She is kind of the idealistic, she believes in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and the, truthfulness of the American dream. And so the story follows Ludi as she attempts to build a life for herself and for her son, who she calls Bub, after she moves to Harlem and she left her husband, right? So she's a single mother living in Harlem. But throughout the novel, she finds herself confronted with the realities of racism, classism, and sexism. The novel is tragedy, and it highlights the specific impact of the streets on Black familial relationships and the pursuit of social mobility, right? So it's really saying, here's what the streets are, and here's the reality of how they impact, your relationships and your beliefs and your belief system. So you'll notice throughout here I put from the street to the streets, because in many ways what Petry does in a number of kind of artistic ways is she takes 116th Street, which is called The Street throughout the book, right? I mean, that's the title too. And she takes that kind of entity, and I use that word for a reason. We'll talk about that. And really, throughout the novel, what it ends up with is an example of what we've been talking about as the streets this entire time, or the hood, right, or the ghetto. She takes the specific streets that these people live on and uses the novel to demonstrate that it's so much more than just this street, but that it's, this larger kind of entity that impacts Black life in all these ways. So One of the ways that she does this is through her use of nature imagery. And again, I know this isn't a literary class, so bear with me, but you should know just some of this. You should know she uses nature imagery, and let me walk you through what I mean by that, right? And I put a couple of quotes up here, but I'm going to explain this to you. So I know you just read the beginning, right? But to really understand it, she does like this circular narrative here. So she opens with this imagery of a cold, horrible kind of scene on a street, which all of you having lived in New York, like you can probably feel this, right? I have felt that having, spent some time on the East Coast as well as grown up in the Midwest in Minnesota. It's already snowing here. So I think we all know what they're experiencing, but let's walk through what she's doing with this, right? So the very beginning of the novel starts with this kind of detailed imagery, but it also starts to personify the streets, which is something we'll come back to. So the opening lines go, "There was a cold November wind blowing through 116th Street. It rattled the tops of garbage cans, sucked window shades out through the top of open windows, and set them flapping back again against the windows. Fingering its way along the curb, the wind sets the bits of paper dancing high in the air, so the barrage of paper swirled into the faces of people on the street." So here it's interesting to think about what's personified, right? So the wind is personified as a violent menace, right? It's rattling garbage cans, it's fingering through people's belongings. It's described as if it's like disruptive or antagonistic, right? So the wind already, the opening scene of the environment is of this cold, menacing environment, right? And then this becomes even clearer if you're kind of like, well, it's just a winter day, right? This becomes even clearer as she continues on, or as it continues on the narration, where it says that it did everything it could to discourage the people walking along the street. It found all the dirt and dust and grime on the sidewalk and lifted it up so that the dirt got into their noses, making it difficult to breathe. The dust got into their eyes and blinded them to the grit, and the grit stung their skins. It wrapped newspapers around their feet, entangling them until the people cursed deep in their throats, stamped their feet, kicked at the paper. The wind blew it back again and again until they were forced to stoop and dislodge the paper with their hands. And then the wind grabbed at their hats, ripped their scarves from around their necks, stuck its fingers inside their coat collars, blew their coats away from their bodies. So here, the wind is like actively antagonistic, right? The impact of the wind goes beyond just kind of a chaotic stirring of trash, right? So it's described here as having this intentional kind of menacing aspect, right? It wants to thwart the movement of the people who are just walking down the street trying to go about their business. And the description of dust and dirt and grime should be familiar to you, right? So when we think of some of the imagery that is associated with urban landscapes, it's often this dirty, dusty, dark city, right? Gritty urban realism is often something that's used in film. But the difference here is the way it's described, right? So this dirt and grime isn't just sitting there part of the landscape, but it's actively attempting to blind and choke people, right? So the newspaper chains entangle them, which make, it signifies like an inescapability of things. And then there's this cyclical action of the wind blows and it makes them try their different attempts to free themselves only to find that the wind blew it back and back again, right? So it's almost as if there's this cycle of antagonism that these people are trapped in, right? And then even when these people are at their lowest point and they can't escape, the wind delivers its final blow, right? It sticks its fingers inside their throat collars and it strips them of their only remaining covers, right? Their coats, their scarves, things like that. So as the novel begins, the landscape itself, right, the environment is set up not just as kind of cold or dreary or dirty, but as a cold and dreariness that actively threatens and fights against the people, right? So it's interesting to think about the way that she describes the environment that way, because at the very end of the book, again, this is like a circular narrative here, she comes back to this very idea of what the environment does to people. And so we'll talk about the ending and how we get there. But at it ends with Ludi fleeing town, and when she's leaving town, she thinks to herself, it was that street. It was that goddamn street. The snow fell softly on the street. It muffled sound. It sent people scurrying homeward, so that the street was soon deserted, empty, quiet. And it could have been any street in the city, for the snow laid a delicate film over the sidewalk, over the brick of the tired old buildings, gently obscuring the grime and the garbage and the ugliness. So it's interesting because here the snow is hiding the reality of the street, right? But she knows it because she's lived through it and she's running away from it. And it's interesting that she says, well, it could be any other street, but it's not, right? Because underneath that facade, underneath what covers it and hides the reality of the streets, of this segregated space, is grime, is ugliness, are all these antagonistic forces that were set up in the beginning of the novel. So really, what I want you to maybe think about, or what you should know about this book, is that Petry uses nature and imagery of nature to talk about as a way to kind of represent the social forces at play in the streets, right? So she uses kind of the, the forces of the wind and the snow and the weather, things we can have a visceral reaction to. We know what it's like to have wind blow dirty things in your face or try to rip your scarf off of you. You know how horrible that feels, right? So she uses that kind of more universal experience as a parallel to the social forces and the antagonistic social forces that Black people living in spaces like 116th Street face. So that's one key thing about this novel. The next thing that I've kind of alluded to, but I want to dig into a little bit more deeply, is the way that she uses personification, right? And so we talked about how she did that a little bit with the wind, but the biggest thing that happens in this book is the way the street is slowly personified throughout, right? So, and you see this a little bit in the section you read, because she talks about 116th Street and she's kind of curious about certain aspects of it. But I'm going to talk to you about a few other places throughout where it becomes very obvious that the street is the largest threat to Ludi and her son. So in the part you read, it becomes clear. You notice she's looking at the apartment and she notices her, the superintendent, Jones. It's really building up this kind of anticipation of how creepy he is, right? She's like, oh, he's looking at me. My skin is crawling. Like, you can tell that there's a menacing intention and he is a creep, right? So on the surface level, he'd be the obvious antagonist of this novel, right? He's got an unhealthy obsession with her, and it does culminate in an attempt to rape her, right? So he's he's a gross figure. But even more than Jones, right, who is obviously kind of, an antagonist in the novel, the real main threat or antagonist is the street itself, right? Because the street works slowly and methodologically to wear down various characters. And that's something that Ludi takes note of throughout the book, but she's trying to fight it until ultimately she succumbs to it as well, right? So one example of this is her neighbor, Mrs. Hedges, right? So Mrs. Hedges, and what the street does to her. She is physically scarred from a building. So what happened is she lived in, one of the slums, right? And there was a fire and she was trapped in it. And so she's left physically scarred. And so what happens is Mrs. Hedges ends up figuring out or colluding with the streets, even though the streets are what have put her in this position. So let me walk you through that, right? Mrs. Hedges, I think, what is it, the quote down? Oh, these are both from her, but I'm going to walk you through Mrs. Hedges. I should have put this quote on here as well, but she's worth noting. So Mrs. Hedges, she starts a brothel at her home, essentially, right? And so how it comes to be is fascinating. So after the fire, right? So she's scarred in the slum fire. She's trying to recover. So she has this young woman, Mary, move into her home, and she lives in the same building as Ludi, right? Ludi moves into this building. But Mrs. Hedges has this young woman, Mary, move in to help her with cleaning and cooking and things like that because she's recovering. Well, one night, Mary has a young man come and visit. And so it's when he comes to visit, and we know what visit means. Mrs. Hedges realizes she can take advantage of this, right? And make a little money off of their affair. So this is kind of a pivotal moment for both Mrs. Hedges and in the novel how we talk about the street. So what happens is Mrs. Hedges kind of switches from being just a victim of the street to its accomplice, right? So before she's a victim, she, falls prey to the slum fire, she's scarred, she's recovering, but now she kind of recognizes the dangers of the streets and finds a way that she can also profit off of those dangers, right? In the moment that this is happening, Mrs. Hedges, I do have the quote up here, good. This is that top quote here, where she says, "The street would provide plenty of customers, for there were so many men just like him who knew vaguely that they hadn't gotten anything out of life and knew clearly that they never would get it. Men who had to find escape from their hopes and fears," right? So it's interesting to think how it's not just the street and the expectation of, him coming to have a little meeting with this young woman, but the desperation and the sense of hopelessness, something we saw the poets last week talking about, right? What happens when you're in those conditions? How do you dream? If you even have time. Well, Mrs. Hedges knows that internalized hopelessness, because of all the forces of racism around, push people to find escapes, and so she finds a way that she can kind of profit off of that, right? So not soon after she sends this young man in to see Mary, she has kind of a moment of her own role or awareness of the street and its role in her hustle. And this is that second quote here where she says, "She knew so much about this particular block, right, that she came to regard it as slightly different from any other place. When she referred to it as the street, her lips seemed to linger over the words as though her mind paused at the sound to write capital letters." This is that personification here, right? That the street becomes capital T, capital S, the street. And then enclose the words in quotation marks, thus setting it off and separating it from any other street in the city, giving it an identity unmistakable and apart. So it's interesting to think, again, this idea of separation and apartness. One speaks to the policies and the realities we know about geographic segregation and the very specific streets or neighborhoods or places in Harlem that people like Mrs. Hedges and other Black people were made to live, right? But also this idea of the street as an entity. This is the first time we really see it kind of articulated like this in the book. And it's characterized as an entity that produces hopelessness and fearfulness, that it's that what it fosters in people's souls in terms of that hopelessness makes them ripe for exploitation, right? And so this really is what I'm saying demonstrates that the street itself becomes the main antagonist. It's the street that makes people hopeless. It's the street that makes them ripe for exploitation. It's the street that causes the conditions for Mrs. Hedges to both become the victim of a slum fire and the, owner of a brothel, right? And so Mrs. Hedges becomes both a product and a victim of the streets, right? So she's kind of in this contradictory space between, somewhat empowered or finding agency. I wouldn't say empowered actually, but agency in saying, if this is the conditions I'm in, I might as well find a way to make some money. But also she's perpetuating the very systems responsible for, exploiting people like herself, right? Or like Mary who lives with her. So that's the way that Petry, I think, throughout the novel uses personification and the different kind of conditions and events that happen to different characters to portray the street itself as this menacing force or this antagonist. And throughout the novel, Ludi becomes kind of more and more aware of the dangers of the street, right? But she's determined that she's going to overcome it, or she's going to be the exception. And this is, again, going back to Ludi as this representational figure, the protagonist who says, well, other people might fall prey to that, but, not me, right? And so I put this last quote where she says, she wasn't afraid of its influence, right? The street, for she would fight against it. Streets like 116th Street or being colored or a combination of both, right? So all this racism and geographic segregation had turned Pop, her father, into a sly old man who drank too much, had killed Mom off when she was in her prime. And she goes on to say, the same combination of circumstances had evidently made the Mrs. Hedges, who sat on the street floor window, turn to running a fairly well-kept whorehouse, but unmistakably a whorehouse. And the superintendent of the building, well, the street had pushed him into basements, away from light and air, until he was being eaten up by some horrible obsession. And still, other streets had turned Min, the woman who lived with the superintendent, into a drab drudge so spineless and so limp that she was like a soggy dish rag. None of those things would happen to her, Ludi decided, because she would fight back and never stop fighting back. So it's interesting to think how Ludi, I'm going to explain, there it is, my Z disappeared for a second, how Ludi recognizes, well, maybe I'll go back in this last quote, all the conditions and forces of the streets, right? And how the street that she's living on in Harlem and that geographically segregated space, as well as the various other racialized spaces that her father or other people lived in, she knows that this is what has driven people, to suffer things like slum fires, to, open up whorehouses, to turn to addiction, to internalize things like the superintendent is, and themselves perpetrate violence like he later does when he tries to rape her. Like, she recognizes these cycles and the cycles of violence and exploitation, but she somehow thinks that for all the kind of larger entity of the street and what it does to people, she can escape it by sheer kind of individual will. And the plot of what happens to Ludi is really Petry's way of deconstructing that myth, but we'll talk about that. So one of the ways that she does that is in really, I think I'm gonna skip that, is really looking at this idea of the streets, which we just talked about, everything she recognizes and what the threats of the streets are, versus the dream, right? And I put these two words because when we read Ta-Nehisi Coates, he uses the streets and the dream throughout. And even though Petry doesn't really say the dream in that way, she does. Ludi embodies the American dream in those ideologies, right? So despite that, she's, very much believes that she can work her way up. And so she embodies kind of the sensibilities of American meritocracy, right? That you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps so you get what you deserve. So despite this, and the fact that she does have some success, right? She works her way through night school. She becomes a file clerk. She still struggles to get kind of that social mobility she really wants. And she's concerned for her son, and she's worried that while she's out, because she later takes up singing to see if that will help her move up the social ladder even more, she's worried about what's going to happen to her son after school when she's at work or when she's out, singing. So she often throughout the novel talks about the dangers of the streets and what those will do to her son. And that's the kind of one time she kind of acknowledges that they are real and that you can't just avoid them by sheer kind of will. Ludi's preoccupation with the streets as a threat to her son really comes to a head one day in this scene where she finds her son essentially not pretending, but working as a shoeshine boy, right? So at first she doesn't notice that it's him. So she's trying to make her way home from work, and she keeps hearing someone say, "Shine, miss," over and over again. And she just ignores it because she's thinking, oh, it's just some poor shoeshine boy, right? She even in her head is like lamenting the fact that boys like that are out on the street stuck shining shoes, right? Until finally her son, Bub, gets her attention. And then she's horrified by the fact that her own son is a shoeshine boy. Well, he's just trying to make some extra cash after school, and finds it as here's a great way I can do that. Her response is that she slaps him 3 times and she exclaims, and then I'm going to read the quote, "I'm working to look after you, and you out here in the street shining shoes like the rest of these little N words." I won't say it because different people have different responses to that word. So the fact that she calls her son the N-word is significant because it speaks to her own understanding of how labor is racialized in class, right? Like she thinks, well, we're better than that. Like if you're shining shoes, you really are an N-word. But if we're black people who are working hard and I'm working my way up the social ladder, we're not really like that. So it's interesting to think how, as a character, she herself reflects some of these racist kind of ideologies. So she berates him. But later she really kind of admits to herself her anger isn't a direct result of Bub's, out there shining shoes, but her frustration that her son is forced to do that while the little Henry Chandlers of the world, which is the son of the family she used to be a domestic servant for, get to wear fine clothes and live in nice homes and attend good schools. So I've put up here these images that we looked at before from Ebony Magazine and Life, because again, I want you to see connections between the different units we're looking at. And this is something that Petry does because Ludi is herself a consumer of these very same images, even though they're not made for her. So when she's working for the Chandlers, which is this wealthy white family, she sees their home and their son and the things they have, and her desire for that is why she moves to the city and is trying to become a clerk and then a singer and all these things. But there's a disconnect between, what she wants for her son and what she sees white Americans can have for their families and what she's experiencing. One of the ways that Petry deconstructs the myth of U.S. meritocracy is through the kind of experiences Ludi has and comparing herself to whiteness, right? And there's various types of whiteness that she does this with. So one of them is, she's working for the Chandlers, right? And so they're this wealthy white family that, has this huge house, and they're constantly talking about, Benjamin Franklin and his kind of good advice and all these things. And so she listens to them and she really buys into this belief that if you just work hard enough and go to the right schools, you can have whatever you want. Well, they're kind of the maybe obvious example of what she aspires to. But even there's another white family, the Pizzinis, that she compares herself to. So before she can get this job for the Chandlers, she has to get a reference from her former employer, Mrs. Pizzini. And so the Pizzinis are Italian immigrants. And if you remember what we talked about first when we started looking at policy and the creation of geographic segregation, you know that a huge part of what's happening at this time in the mid-20th century is that these policies are allowing groups like the Pizzinis, like white immigrants, right? White immigrants that weren't quite folded into whiteness before. This allows them to move into the suburbs, to move into kind of middle-class normative whiteness. And so this is really what she's seeing with them. So the Pizzinis are Italian, and they own the local grocery store. But despite their status as small business owners, they're not well educated, right? Even though, again, Ludi herself is well educated. In fact, Mrs. Pizzini has to have her daughter write the reference letter because her and her husband are illiterate, right? Or at least in English. So Ludi is working for these white immigrants who have a lesser education than her, but yet they're able to find their way into owning a small business and also a nice home, right? So it's interesting to think how, while they are ethnically not, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, their whiteness allows them to, access to home ownership and social mobility, where that same opportunity is not extended to Ludi. And so it's one of the ways in the book this idea of meritocracy is challenged, because it's, regardless of what Ludi does, her blackness means that certain things are inaccessible to her, right? So when she finally gets this job with the Chandlers, she kind of studies them, and as she's working as their domestic, servant, right? She's seeing all the things they own. She's enamored by everything, and she absorbs their ideologies and really thinks, if I can just work hard, I can get to whatever I want. So she begins to daydream and, really buy into this belief of working her way up. And so one key example I want to show you is just the contrast between the world that she consumes and kind of, idolizes, and the reality of what she's living. So on the left is a passage from the chapter you read, and this describes the apartment that she gets, right? So she explains, she's thinking to herself, one thing about it, the rent wouldn't be very much. It couldn't be for a place like this. Tiny hall. The whole apartment would fit very neatly into just one good-sized room. She was conscious that all the little rooms smelled exactly alike. It was a mixture that contained the faint, persistent odor of gas, of old walls, dusty plaster, and over it all, the heavy, sour smell of garbage. So this place is like those kitchenettes almost, although a step up, because again, this is for her a big deal, that there was a tiny room. She said once you got the bed and the dresser, you couldn't really move around in there, but it was a room, which is huge. It wasn't just your kitchen and you live in one same spot studio. But it's dirty, it smells like garbage, it's dusty, right? But this was her step up, right? And in contrast, she's being kind of surrounded by images like the one on the right. So on one of her commutes, she's seeing this ad and describing it in this kind of like, idealistic tone, right? Where she talks about the linoleum floor of the kitchen was a crisp black and white pattern that pointed up the sparkle of the room. Casement windows, red geraniums in yellow pots. It was, she thought, a miracle of a kitchen, completely different from the kitchen of the 116th apartment she had moved into just 2 weeks ago. So there's some irony here, right? That she moves into this apartment to move on up and pursue social mobility. She's working hard at all these jobs, and while she's doing it, literally while she's commuting to this job, she's being bartered with, the things being afforded to her white counterparts, like the Bazzinis, right? Definitely to the Chandlers, because they're actually wealthy, but the Bazzinis weren't wealthy, right? They were immigrants who were able to get into the middle class because of policies that subsidized things for them. But they get the shiny, bright, new kitchen, new life, where she's living, her step up is this dingy, garbage-smelling apartment. And so that contrast between Ludi's idealism and Ludi's reality is one of the ways that the novel itself deconstructs her belief system. So I think I'm going to wrap this up soon. But I want to talk just finally about, this idea of challenging kind of the American dream as being the main theme of the book in many ways. So we've already talked about the fact that Ludi embodies the sensibilities of American meritocracy and that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? She sees the reality of the street, right? She knows what it's done to Mrs. Hedges. She knows what it's done to other people, but she thinks that she can fight against it. Slowly, though, she begins to acknowledge the impact of the streets. So when she sees Bub's shining shoes, she's enraged by what that means for Bub's future. She starts to realize that she lives in an area without playgrounds, without after-school activities, without parks, right? And so as a result, Bub doesn't have access to those goods, so he's left without with anything to do after school, right? So first he tries shining shoes, and when she gets angry about that, he's looking for something to do. And this is what sets him up for kind of the big climactic issue for Bub, at least, right? So without that time, he gets caught up with Jones, the superintendent, and he gets him involved in mail fraud, and that gets Bub into trouble where he is arrested and imprisoned, and then Ludi has to figure out a way to deal with that, right? So he's tricked into performing this mail fraud by Jones, who, again, Jones is the creepy superintendent who was obsessed with Ludi and tried to rape her, but she gets away. So then he tricks the son into this mail fraud, and he's arrested. So after this happens, Ludi's starting to realize, like, despite her getting these jobs, despite her becoming a singer, despite her moving into this apartment and thinking she can just force her way up the social ladder, things are falling apart, right? So she goes to see Boots, who's her former band member, and he's another, male character who only sees her as kind of this sexualized object. And so while she's asking him for money to get a lawyer for her son, he attempts to rape her, right? And so in this moment in the book, she's overwhelmed by her circumstances. She's overwhelmed by what the streets have done to her son and what the streets have done to her dream. And so she snaps. And she murders Boots. And what's interesting is in this moment, when she snaps, she notes to herself, as she stared at him at Boots, she felt she was gazing straight at the street with its rows of old houses, its piles of garbage, its swarms of children. So even as she's committing this act of murder, her vision is obstructed, right? So she doesn't really see Boots. She's not in her mind really murdering Boots. But she transforms into kind of this violent uprising against everything the streets have done to her in her life, right? So she does it, and she kills Boots, right? And then after this, she realizes what she's done, and she has to flee town. And in fleeing town, she abandons her young son, right? So it's a extreme tragedy, the book is, right? And in this way, you know, all of her dreams for both herself and her son come crashing down. And this is where you get this quote that I put up here, where she's fleeing town, her son is, you know, in jail, she's murdered someone. Despite all of her hard work and effort, she did not climb the social ladder, right? Quite the opposite. The reality of living in this segregated space as a Black woman has put her in positions where, you know, she's facing in her family issues of incarceration. She's facing the threat of rape. She's facing all these different things until finally she snaps and has to flee town. So as she's leaving, her thoughts were like a chorus chanting inside her head. The men stood around and the women worked. The men left the women and the women went on working. And the kids were left alone. Alone, always alone. And the street reached out and sucked them up. Right? So again, the street is the threat. She's working hard. She's trying to make it. The street stole her child. That's how she's, you know, articulating the pain that she's feeling. And then she continues and really connects what's happening in her circumstance on 116th to Harlem, to the larger system of the U.S. itself. And she says, "Go on," she urged. "Go all the way. Finish it." And the little Henry Chandlers, which is the white boy that she used to be a domestic servant for, go to Yale, Princeton, Harvard, and the Bub Johnsons, her son, graduate from reform school into Dannemora Sing Sing. And you helped push him because you talked to him about money. All the time money. Only you forgot. You forgot you were Black and you underestimated the street outside. So this is like the culmination of this, and why I assigned it is this book, and I wish you were able to read the whole thing. But after, you know, all these desperate ways she tries to pursue her dream, and then all this tragedy befalls her, she kind of identifies the street as the culprit of it all, right? Out of all of the dramatic events that take place, right, it's the street that is really responsible for her life unraveling, right? And it's the fact that she underestimated the street, that she thought she alone could just make it work, that individual hard work would allow her to escape the violence of this segregated geographic space. But instead of what Ludi thought, the book itself paints this tragic picture of inescapability, right? Of violence to her family, of risk of imprisonment. And so the novel ends with the separation of these family members, which, you know, is signaling to a lot of other historical things in like native alienation, but we won't dig into that. But the point is that Petry really, through this book, signals the gravity of those social forces and the reality of the streets and how they impact Black people. But she's also, as an artist, as an author, using the book as a piece of work to challenge that, to say, if we don't turn to these beliefs like individualism and the American dream, if we instead fight against those actual forces, then we really, we're fighting against the street itself rather than just kind of going with what people want us to believe, that if we just work hard enough, it's okay. By identifying the streets as the culprit, she suggests that that's the way that we make a change, by addressing the streets themselves. So I know that I've spent quite a bit of time with this, but I'm hoping that this is one example, and then we'll look at Ta-Nehisi Coates later. But you're seeing how Black authors, even early authors like this in the 1940s, were already thinking about the streets, right, as this geographic, this Black geographic space that has a huge impact on Black life. And they're thinking through, if we understand that, how do we then respond to it?